Welcome to another episode. This is my brand new podcast, Behind Beliefs and Behaviors, Getting to the Root with yours truly, Dr. Maiysha. These first episodes are really just an insight into the journey of starting a new podcast. Some of you may have been listening to the Black Mind Garden, and even some of you may have in the past listened to Next Level Physicians Thriving Outside of the Box. And so you know that I am no stranger to podcasting. But why would I go and start a new one? Well, if you listen to the last episode or the first two episodes, you have a bit of background. And as I said, these first few episodes are really just an insight and an introduction to where this podcast is going. But today, I want to talk a little bit about transitions and what's behind transitions. And I'll start by saying that I'll give you the punchline first, and then I'll backtrack and break it down. I think what's behind transitions is multifactorial. But for me, and for many people, and maybe people don't always recognize this aspect, is that what's behind transition is really completion. Now, in the first episode, I talked a little bit about completion and the fact that it's okay to acknowledge when something feels complete. But I think sometimes we miss completion and we maybe label it other things. And sometimes completion can come out of necessity, and sometimes it actually is created. So what I want to talk a little bit about is the created transition rather than the forced transition, because that's exactly how this new podcast began, is a created transition. As we go through our lives, we are always growing and expanding. We are always evolving. And sometimes the things that we're doing, the actions that we're taking, the paths that we're on, we outgrow. And when we start to notice, we don't always notice at first that we're outgrowing these paths. But if we listen to ourselves, listen to first our bodies, and you're going to hear me talk a little bit about, and if you followed me and if you've listened to the talks that I've done, if you've listened to my podcast, The Black Mind Garden, you know I talk a lot about the somatic intelligence and listening to our bodies. And if we really listen to our bodies when we're on a particular path, whether that path is a career path, whether it's a relationship path, whether it's an entrepreneurship or business path, whether it's a financial path, an investment path, you name it, a friendship path, we have paths that we're on, and we can feel it in our body as we evolve when the path begins to shift and change, and when we're not in alignment with the path that we're on, or when we've outgrown the path that we're on and we feel the calling for something new. Maybe it's the calling for something bigger, or maybe it's the calling for something completely different. But when we feel that calling, we can feel it in our body before our brain can process it. And so sometimes if we hang on to that path for too long, our transition will be forced. But when we recognize it early enough and we acknowledge it for what it is, we can take it like an object and examine it. And we can examine, is this a point of completion, or is this a point where it's time to level up on that same path? Because not everything is completion. Sometimes it's we're staying on the path and there's something that needs to happen to level us up to that next place of evolution, that next place of growth on the same path. Now that's still transition. It may not be a complete pivot. It's still transition. But sometimes when we examine whatever that is, that misalignment or that calling or whatever that thing is, we come to note that it feels like, you know what? I'm good. I'm complete. It's exactly what happened in my private practice. I ran my private practice for 10 years, and I knew that I was being called into something else. And I remember when I went out on maternity leave after having my son, and being out for that 8 weeks gave me the huge realization after I didn't miss it as much as I thought that I would. Even though I loved what I was doing in my clinical practice, when I left it, I didn't miss it. And it came to me. I think that I'm coming up on a point of completion. Now, I did end up practicing for 3 more years inside of that practice, because sometimes the transition takes time. It takes preparation. So just because you come to a point of transition or a point of completion doesn't mean you screech to a halting stop and pivot if you're creating the transition, right? Remember I said there's the forced transition and there's the created transition. So when you recognize it early, you recognize you're coming to that point of completion, you're coming to that point of transition, whether it's a level up on the same path or pivot to a different path. When you recognize it early, it gives you the space to prepare for the transition so that it feels smooth and feels workable and feels comfortable. And that is exactly how it's been for me in my transitions, in my career transitions. So yes, this transition to this new podcast is a created transition, because I feel the evolution and the growth in the work that I'm doing, in the impact that I want to make, in the message that I share, and in the communities in which I sit. And that is what is behind this transition to behind beliefs and behaviors. That's what's at the root. So this is the start of a conversation that's going to be expanded in multiple contexts. And I want you on that journey with me. So I invite you to subscribe now, and please share this podcast, share this episode with at least 2 or 3 other people in your life, because we want to cause a ripple effect. This is not just a podcast. This is a movement. And we want to be able to, if we want to be able to make the kind of change that we want to make in the world, then we all must begin to evaluate what is behind our beliefs and our behaviors. With that, I leave you until the next episode. Stay empowered.